webinar on community violence intervention. My name is Umair Shafiq and I am the executive editor of Inquiry, a peer-reviewed open access journal that is focused on public health and policy. Now, community-centered violence intervention is an important and promising approach towards reducing gun violence. However, there are significant evidence gaps that remain and that need to be addressed. So to address this, we will be publishing out a special collection titled Community-Centered Strategies to Reduce Gun Violence, Developing Evidence for Policy and Practice. Today we are joined by an esteemed panel of experts who will discuss the importance of this work, the challenges of generating evidence, and the key research needs. And our hope is that today's webinar inspires new ideas on how you might contribute to our special collection and address the evidence gaps. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our lead guest editor and chair for today's webinar, Professor Jeffrey Butts. Jeff is the research professor and director of the Research and Evaluation Center at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, and he has extensive experience and thought leadership in this space. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Butts, and I'm a research professor at John Jay College, which is part of the City University of New York. And we're here to talk about this important upcoming special issue of Inquiry. It's my pleasure to welcome some colleagues that I've known for a long time who are all very important in this field. My co-editor of the special issue is Katerina Roman. I've known her since she was Katerina Guvas Roman at Temple University. Also, we have Andrew Papachristos from Northwestern University, who I believe is a sociologist by training. Alessandra Early, who is a colleague of mine at John Jay College, who focuses on qualitative evidence for public safety programs. And Daniel Webster from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, who's one of the foremost experts in our country about gun policy and gun violence prevention. So we'll be discussing this upcoming special issue and describe its purpose and talk about some of the challenges facing the research field as we all collaborate and work together to try to build evidence to reduce violence using a variety of perspectives, techniques, and tools. I would like to start off just by making a few points about the purpose of this special issue. And because the Sage Journal is focused on health and health policy, I want to draw a simplistic analogy, which is when we think about illness, there are major disciplines that contribute toward the resolution and treatment of illness. And one of those is medicine, where you intervene with people and populations known to be afflicted by a disease. And then the other major profession is public health, who develop policies, programs, structures, and approaches to raise the level of health across the entire community and prevent the need for medicine and intervention at the individual level. And the same analogy applies to the field of violence prevention and even gun violence prevention. We have ongoing policy battles about a couple of things, one of which is theory, meaning why does violence occur? How do we prevent it? Why this population, that population, this place, that place? We're constantly debating the origins and causes and forces that generate violence, interpersonal violence. The other debate we constantly have is about evidence. How do we know these things work? Who's responsible for making them better? To what extent should the policy to prevent violence be governed by public opinion and politics and electoral politics? And to what extent should it be purely science-based? Those debates have been going on for centuries. I've been in this field quite a long time, and I wish I could say I see a lot of progress, but I continually see us reverting back to old models. In this country, in the US, our soon-to-be former administration, our current administration, invested hundreds of millions of dollars in something they called community violence intervention. And in this country, everyone got used to talking about CVI, community violence intervention. The problem was it wasn't strictly defined, and in the community of people working on violence prevention, you will hear people talk about CVI as if it means a public health approach, because the word community is in the name. But when you read the text from government publications and funding announcements and so forth, you see that it's not strictly that. It does include what I would say would be analogous more to medicine, which is finding out who has the disease and intervening to prevent them from being harmed by the disease or spreading the disease. Again, which is an important component of public safety policy, but that's not the same thing as a public health approach. It's just easy for us, especially in our political culture, to revert back to the oldest model of public safety, which is who's endangering the safety, let's go get them, let's identify them, and let's hold them accountable through punishment, through confinement. That model continually rears up when the public is either concerned about public safety or is given reason to be concerned by our elected officials. And we've never totally embraced a more holistic, evidence-based, theoretically derived model. This journal's special issue focuses on the need for evidence about interventions to prevent violence that operate at the level of communities, meaning they use community mechanisms to improve public safety. And that's a challenge because, again, people hear the word community and they think, oh, I do a drug treatment program for high school students who live in my community, therefore I'm community-based. But that's treating one particular aspect of public safety with defined individuals. That's not the same thing as leveraging community structures. We have other things that are obviously leveraging community structures, like focusing on space, focusing on green space in a community, focusing on the quality of buildings and just the perceived orderliness of the community, which is related to public safety and can be feasibly studied because green space and buildings don't tend to move around very much and they don't have their own opinions. So you could actually study them and have a controlled study, even experimental, to see if those make a difference for public safety. Programs that attempt to work with human beings in the community who do not identify certain individuals as the problem would be more public health oriented, but it's difficult to collect that data to study them. We will get into this in this conversation and also in the special issue. That's my opening take. I will then ask my co-editor, Katerina Roman, to come in and straighten me out and tell me what I've said, which is incorrect, and how you perceive this issue. And after you talk to us for a bit, we'll go to the whole group and have a exchange of ideas and challenge each other. So, Katerina.
Thank you, Jeff. I think you really covered a lot of issues there. And I think because we've worked together for 30 years, what you and I remember talking with you when we were back working at the Urban Institute about why are there so few effective interventions to do community change level work, right? We all know violence is a complex issue. We all have different opinions and theories related to the root causes of violence. So putting this all together, we're attempting to create community change. And I have constantly struggling with, do we even know enough? Putting criminology, criminal justice, and public health aside, do we even know how to do effective change, whatever the intervention is, to make long-term investments in neighborhood that pay off in terms of community well-being? And you bring violence in, and we all think about these community violence interventions as you mentioned, it's harder when you're touching individuals and then trying to make behavior change that impacts the community level. I think the beauty of this special issue is because it gives scholars out there the opportunity to think at many points in that entire ecological model of community risk and resilience. Where can we make change when it comes to community violence? So with the CVI, with the community violence interventions, just as you said, there's been this push-pull related to these person-focused interventions, these behavioral changes to make the change at the community level, we don't really know enough about all the different factors that can come together, intervention, to create that change. This special issue gives us the opportunity to peel back those layers at all points when you think about that ecological model and how the intervention is centered within a community. So from my point, I am very interested in seeing papers that speak to all of these contexts. How do you situate an intervention within a neighborhood? You have the intervention, you have the organization, you have the macro level context. What is the right ingredients? Do we know enough about not just the mechanisms of change, but then that larger context of where and how the organization and the individuals doing that intervention work? How does that work? What are those layers? That, I think, is for me really exciting about this special issue. And unpacking that, not just the theory of change related to community-centered interventions, but thinking about these other factors that we often term them implementation science, but I don't think we need to even be that specific, but really welcome scholars who are thinking about the various layers. Maybe they interact, maybe they don't. Papers that are centered on these various features are going to be exciting to see for me.
Well, I'll ask Daniel Webster to kick off the conversation if you're willing, because you're a recognized public health expert. And my question to you is, have you noticed that the field has been using the term public health in a very broad, undefined sense that means goodness and light and good intentions? Have you noticed that we've been abusing your field of interest as a name?
Yes, I've been taking notice for about 30 years about that. And I believe I think I developed the first course on violence prevention in a school of public health back in 1993. And what I started to do with that course, and frankly continue to do, is to challenge public health students to define it themselves and to give them a broad array of things that should be considered if you're going to take a public health approach. Now, I differ a little bit, perhaps, from Jeff in the distinction between medicine and public health. I do emphasize that almost, the vast majority of what is done in the name of public health on this issue looks more like a medical or clinical model than sort of a comprehensive public health approach. The way I talk about it anyway is that medicine is just one branch of public health that, I think if you're going to be effective in reducing violence, you do actually need a good sort of clinically oriented mind to work with individuals who are already at very high risk, already probably engaged in violence, in order to address community violence. But that's not a full public health comprehensive approach. It's more of the things of what you and Katerina were emphasizing about the community conditions that are well studied, that we know are highly correlated and causally connected to rates of violence. And, sort of what I emphasize in my teaching and scholarship is, more than anything, a public health approach is creating conditions where people are safe. And that addresses, or should ideally address, the easy availability of firearms. It should address the concentration of alcohol outlets, something we know is causally connected to violence. It should address concentrated disadvantage and sort of the strength of community to come together and solve problems together, something that sociologists refer to as collective efficacy. There are more dimensions to this, and I love that you sort of in your opening remarks, Jeff, mentioned the environmental conditions changing, blight, basically creating green spaces, creating opportunities for community to actually come together to have strong social bonds so that they can have a healthy community where people promote norms that go against violence. So I think that those are kind of some of the key elements. But I think sadly, most of what is being done in the name of public health doesn't come close to this more comprehensive approach. I do want to really single out for praise some of the work that Eugenia South has done in Philadelphia at University of Pennsylvania's Urban Health Lab. I think actually they may have renamed it something about health and justice. But the approach I really hold up to my own students as really being community focused and having a public health approach, and very much in partnership with community. They have facilitated changes that relate to, again, cleaning and greening and addressing vacant buildings, and also helping low-income homeowners maintain their homes in some of their studies, and a variety of things that all kind of connect to some of the basic research done, again, by some of the leading sociologists that basically helps hold community together to reduce residential instability. So I think that there's, I guess also I want to emphasize that they address alcohol outlets as well. So I think they're touching a lot of these bases in a way that I really want to hold up as part of this very comprehensive approach, getting back to let's focus on changing conditions that promote violence and create conditions that constrain or prevent violence.
At this point, I want to ask Alessandra to jump in. Alessandra, you must feel very confident about our public health future because we all have such great administrative data sets and from the police, and we can just analyze all our data and produce nice tables. And that's all we need, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's interesting because so all of my work is qualitative. And so I spend a lot of time with people who are working in these programs, people who are affected by violence, community level stuff, shadowing staff workers who are implementing violence prevention. And a lot of the frustration that I've seen through some of the work that I've done rely upon this notion of what does it mean to interrupt violence? What does it mean for the violence interrupter? What does it mean for people who are living through this violence? And what does it mean for research to kind of reflect or kind of break away from what's actually happening on the ground? And it's interesting because qualitative work, as we know, is often subjugated and kind of in the shadow of quantitative work. So like you were saying, Jeff, kind of facetiously, this kind of work exists in that shadow. Then existing in the shadow means that we're not actually understanding what's happening. And we're also not understanding the real toll and the real cost of this. So not just financially, right? So qualitative work takes a lot of time. It's very costly. If you're working with grants, a lot of granting agencies don't want to spend a lot of that time or the money. It's hard to predict how many interviews you're going to get. It's hard to predict when you're going to reach saturation, theoretical saturation. And it's also hard to kind of ask these folks who are working these programs to take the time because their time is sometimes related to loss of life, right? So some of the people that I interviewed, for example, were shot at. Some of the people that I talked to and shadowed were also experiencing a lot of mental health issues related to doing this kind of work. And then also they're not getting paid enough. they're not getting paid enough to get shot at, not getting paid enough to also be on the ground. And some of the programs that I'm also looking at explicitly do not work with the police, right? So in our society, we have agreed that the police are the ultimate sources of authority, right? So they're the ones who are supposed to intervene with violence. They're the ones who are supposed to break up these conflicts. But because we know there's a historical tension between the police and the communities in which they're policing, oftentimes working with the police is a hindrance, right? So they cannot work with the police because if they do, they're not considered to be credible, they're not considered to be legitimate, and therefore people who are engaging in violence may not want to work with them. So all this to say, some of this work can be very frustrating for a qualitative researcher, not only because we don't have a lot of the structures built in to support this kind of work, but also because it's very difficult to capture and represent accurately and ethically what it means for people to kind of navigate violence. I'll also say that a lot of these programs are understaffed. They're under budgeted, so they don't have a lot of money that's coming in to support them. There's a high turnover rate in some of these programs too, because the work is so challenging and so stressful. But what I found that has been incredibly meaningful for me to see, and where I do see hope for this kind of work, is that a lot of the folks that I've talked to, a lot of the folks that I've shadowed, when I've asked them about how they deal with burnout, how they deal with stress, a lot of them said that they are the work and that they cannot stop doing this work, largely because they come from these communities, they understand what it means to kind of experience this violence, and they've dedicated their lives to this kind of work. And so that's kind of where I see hope. That's also where I kind of see like a lot of the pressure or the tensions and frustrations that sometimes emerge in this kind of work. And then besides that, I mean, it's fascinating because even with this finite amount of resources that a lot of these folks are using and working with, they're still actively reaching some of their goals. So an example would be like Cure Violence, and Cure Violence has a lot of controversy, so I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And it's been interesting seeing that kind of work kind of unfold in the public kind of realm, particularly in St. Louis where I was working. Despite the controversy and all the kind of issues surrounding with the implementation of Cure Violence and stuff like that, what has been fascinating for me to see is that a lot of these goals that quantitative work suggests that Cure Violence, other programs are not reaching, so interrupting violence, right? How do we measure that? Is one intervention enough? Does it have to be 50 interventions a week? Like what is the measurement here? Quantitative research might say 50, qualitative research would say 1, right? So even then we have epistemological differences factoring in here. But a lot of participants that I talked to who are staff said that them doing the work was one way in which the program was reaching the goal. So being employed by Cure Violence, for example, being employed in this work is interrupting violence because a lot of them beforehand were on the street actively engaging in violence. Them also treating themselves as their first participants, right? So setting themselves up as a model for the rest of their community was one way in which some people also reached their goal. And then probably the hardest part is changing community norms, right? So what does that mean to change? How long does it take for time to change? And we could look at through the history of this country, through the world, it takes time to change. But granting agencies, general public, we don't want to wait that time. We don't want to put in that time and that effort to kind of spearhead that change or to give people a chance to change. That is often the biggest challenge for these programs because again, change is hard to measure. Change is also hard to kind of wait for. But as I mentioned before, I do see a lot of hope doing qualitative work because I think, again, while I don't necessarily think that quantitative work can exist without qualitative work can exist without quantitative work, stuff like that. I think they inform each other, but the over-reliance on quantitative work in particular, I think has kind of distorted the image or the possibility of the ways in which these programs can be successful.
All right, thanks. So those of you watching this don't know that we're recording this very early in the morning. So I've saved Andrew Papachristos for last to give him time to wake up because he's an hour behind us. So Andy, I would ask you to address, to start off addressing something which I think about all the time, which is the clumsy, simplistic way that academic research addresses this problem, or people who consume academic research. And the thing I'm thinking about is the unit of analysis problem. That
Yeah.
it's easier to get good statistical results if you intervene with defined individuals and you know who they are and you have multiple contact with them. If you're comparing one community to another community or a neighborhood, you're just not going to get those kind of results statistically. And so we have a lot of people who just will do something, or I often blame elected officials for this. They tell their staffers, go do a search and find out which of these programs ranks most highly in some meta-analysis of program effects. And they always come back with, oh, here's the policing program and here's your psychotherapy, and I'm all done. And these programs never get supported in that world. How do
Right.
we address that? Or first of all, do you agree that that's a problem, and how do we address it?
Oh, what a good question. So I agree it's a problem, and I actually think the question will probably, my response might even thread together a couple of these previous comments, which is, you know, I'm a sociologist by training, you know, but I live in the public health world and the criminology world and sort of these other worlds. Secretly, I know Daniel's a sociologist too. You know, clearly Alessandro's response is kind of fitting in the space. But I bring that point when you start with the unit of analysis, because really sociology and early criminology focused on the fact that crime and violence were actually not the result of individual properties, but in fact these larger conditions. And that was sort of a major win for the establishment of the discipline, right? Which was like, well, why do crime rates continually to be high in neighborhoods as populations change over? And this is not just sort of, you know, these scholars from Chicago, but also W.B. Du Bois looking at Philadelphia, you know, European scholars really trying to understand this phenomenon, which led people to say, look, it's not actually the same, you know, as some individual, you know, genetic defect. There's something in conditions that are socially constructed, segregation, migration patterns, like all of these things that contribute to something, which leads to these problems that Katerina was saying. It was like, well, how do you measure mechanisms at this sort of level? In contrast, almost all of our policy, and even when we think about medicine, trying to skew towards, you know, personalized individual medicine, assumes that the things we see are the result of individual choices or decisions. And yes, economists talks about external constraints. And by the way, I make all kinds of good decisions, all kinds of horrible decisions. People make decisions. But really, you know, when we think about unit of analysis, measuring the community is difficult, right? It's difficult because even communities don't agree. You know, we can look at the most recent election, we can look at any community studies. To say that the Greek community in Chicago agrees on something is absurd, right? As it's true of any community, the Latino community, the Black community, you know, recently arrived citizens community, they all kind of differ. So when we think about these interventions, I think it poses all these problems. The thing is, we know how to measure these things. It's just a lot more complicated. It doesn't fit in a tweet or a soundbite. And actually, to, you know, to go to sort of Daniel's comment, you know, and to your setting this up, Jeff, like we use public health as a shorthand for not criminal justice has basically been the move. But when you get sophisticated to look at like what Daniel said in public health and medicine, there's primary care, secondary care, there are surgeons, there's nutrition, there's, you know, mobility. There are all these dimensions of medicine, but that sort of nuance doesn't come into play. And when we think about, you know, what we call CVI now, you know, as Alejandro said, like people jump to cure violence. It's actually been around 100 years, if not longer. And it started, you know, attached to settlement houses. It had sociologists and social workers involved. You know, we think about Jane Addams' work and other, but the principle was again about a community level change. And it was about meeting individuals where they were, which wasn't in the classroom because they had been locked out or kicked out. It wasn't in the YMCA because they avoided the YMCA. I'm not blaming the YMCA, but whatever institute it was, because of sort of mistrust or distrust. But when we think about the unit of analysis, I think that's the problem. What narrative dominates, you know, particularly American mindset when it comes to policy? It's all individuals, right? From vouchers to opportunities, like it's about individual kind of and how we have those things. But a community intervention is not just getting more individuals to do things, right? I mean, it is, we're not going to arrest our way or CBI or, you know, behavioral therapy our way out of the problem. It's more than that, though we need services for individuals. But I want to come back to how that relates to what Alessandro was saying, which is, I think one of the downsides of medicalizing this problem has been this point of what evidence we accept as being rigorous or valid, right? And by the way, I think all of us in our dusty, journals that nobody reads, we agree that methods should fit questions. That's not what happens on the policy front, right? What happens on the policy front is we discount, as Alessandra just said, we discount certain types of things as less than rigorous, right? Or unable to answer causal questions, which are important. But also there are other important questions that aren't causal questions that we can't even begin to answer in this field that we've been doing for 100 years. We can't tell you how many outreach workers there are in a city, let alone a country. We can't tell you, again, I just want to point out this qualitative work, whether it's a style of intervention that matters, or whether it's a combination of mentoring and interruption and referral. We're not even that close to being able to do that, because often this rich work that people label as descriptive is getting kind of downplayed as evidence. And even in the public health space, we have some of the most important public health interventions in this country had nothing to do with, say, randomized controlled trials, seatbelts, removing lead from water, removing asbestos. Those have saved thousands of lives, but wouldn't even reach the rigor of some of the kind of medical dialogue that gets placed in violence prevention. So I think, this special issue in particular, I'm excited about seeing that. I'm excited about seeing people engage evidence of all sorts and what it means. And again, one of my colleagues had just mentioned, like, how much evidence is enough? I don't have the answer to that question, but I also think the converse happens, especially in this space, which is the evaluation of one program or one city is often taken as evidence to just destroy, a field. And I'd mentioned recently, the numbers change, but in clinical trials, only 8 to 10% ever actually succeed. But nobody disfunds medicine and fires doctors or hospitals or public health workers because RCTs fail, right? And yet in this space right now, we're facing this bind, which is, oh, it's not working. It didn't work here in this city, therefore it doesn't fail, shut it down, especially with the change of administration. And that's quite unfair. And even when we think about, and I'm happy to talk about how this relates to sort of criminal justice policies, I don't think any cop ever lost their job because of the failure of the DARE program, right? In fact, that kept going on for decades, even though we knew its actual impact on sort of drug use and substance abuse was not what it was supposed to be. And I think when you look at the space about a traumatized workforce that's underpaid, we've got research on this in Chicago, they're working second jobs, they're the sole supporters of their families, they're doing this work. And now we're going to judge that on a workforce performance metric. And so I think level setting both the theories that we think about this, but especially the methods and how they meet is actually the most crucial thing, as we go into 2025.
Katerina.
I think it's really interesting, also to compare this to how we as scholars do police research, right? We don't sit and have this discussion about what are police doing when they get to a call and how do they use their discretion. There's some of that, but because, in my mind, because it's so much easier to just say, we know a police responded, there's the mechanism, a police was sent out to answer this call, then we can evaluate the intervention. So when we look at the quantitative data for the police, we throw out the ones that aren't effective, but we still see this huge body of literature that says these types of policing interventions are successful at the community level. And we never have this discourse. So it's really, really interesting. And in some ways, just having this discussion makes me think, wow, is the audience out there going to be listening to this and saying, well, here's more evidence of all the things we have to study, and we can't do that because we don't have the data. So, we're never going to get there. And then again, we have that this publication bias for all the police literature out there. And as you all, so rightly mentioned, someone does the meta-analysis and looks at policing-led interventions like focused deterrence, GVI, and says, here's the stack of positive, evaluations from these 20 sites, and then Cure Violence and these others, maybe only had a few. So we throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, you know, I think in some ways we have a lot of ground to cover. We, in all of our different fields that are represented here and those that are doing this work, I hope would be advocates for, yes, we have some complications. Yes, we have limitations with data, but at the same time, we see the successes and we're championing where those successes are happening. So I think, Jeff, that's a little bit of worry for me, that here we are very conscious about what's missing, but simply by voicing what's missing may be used against building that body of literature. So using this special issue to say we are optimistic, and Alessandra, I think you use that term, that you feel confident that we're moving in the right direction. We are starting to build that qualitative unpacking of the black box about what's being done. Andrew, you threw out a bunch of things that we don't know, but it's been so rewarding to me going to the criminology conference, and I know seeing the agenda at the firearms research conference, that there are dozens of young scholars and others that are starting to do this work. And those are the papers we want to see, but at the same time, be voicing that there are successes and bringing those successes to light.
Yeah, as you're all talking, I'm remembering one of my uncomfortable moments on a Zoom with a bunch of people talking about violence prevention. And I was focused on developing rigorous evidence. And I usually say in policy environments, you don't get by with stories, that there's always someone willing to vote to cut this program unless you can show them rigorous evidence. And I would see that as being protective. But then hearing this conversation and thinking about this issue, I also think as researchers, are we really helping? Precisely because of that, Katerina, I once did an interview with a reporter and was going into all the details and the complications of the research. And when the story came out, the headline they used was "Cure Violence, the evidence doesn't live up to the hype." And I felt like screaming, like, no, that's not what I was saying. So should we, how do we make room for the qualitative, what I would perhaps unfairly call story-based understandings of something, while still anticipating who's in the elected official ranks, who's willing to kill something because it doesn't develop the evidence they want? How do we do both of those things? I just throw that open to the group.
I think, Andrew, you know, we want to talk about a little bit about your work that's looking at the different levels where CVI comes together. I think that's really beneficial to the field.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a pass. I mean, Jeff, I think there are a couple of things. I think one is for those, like, I look at the people on this call and knowing everyone's work and respecting everybody's work, you know, I think part of it is also training this generation of scholars in terms of how they, actually, I don't think storytelling is bad at all, Jeff. I'm a Greek. We tell stories all the time. We live through stories. And so I think the thing is we need to understand what narrative is and what, you know, how it gets placed in other places, whether it's opinions or talking to politicians. You know, I think my response was different, you know, before the election. I think shifting the conversation and understanding, you know, does it work to what is the work, which is the broad shift. I think that we are all kind of sharing has to be a research focus. It's a workforce question, right? So when we think about the incoming administration, framing it as a workforce issue, which it is, and understanding workforce. And again, we understand public health workforces. We understand other sorts of workforces, teachers, firefighters, first responders. Like, I think that's key. I also think we need to do better in telling our colleagues to stop saying stupid, untrue things on Twitter, on, you know, again, the phrase gold standard. When we nerd out in these journals that we're trying to do, everyone agrees, oh, you can have a good matching design that's just as good as randomization, but that's not what they say when they're at the press conference or at Congress. or on review boards or as the head of foundations. And that, I think, is what trickles down to policy. I mean, first of all, policy selects non-randomly what science they want to use anyways. But I think we don't help, right? We don't help by packaging, what a series of well-crafted interviews in Philly or New York or Chicago or Baltimore can tell us, right? I also think we get afraid by not having the sexy headline, and on the cure violence front, when I did my first evaluation work on cure violence, with Wes Scogan, I was super jonesed. It was like a 20% reduction. I was like, that's fantastic. It worked in, half the neighborhoods, 20, like, why wouldn't you want that? No, people wanted 100% reduction headline, right? Because first of all, who gets a 20% return on any investment? I would love a 7% return on my retirement, but like if you don't have 20%, we're not going to talk about and then how it got politically manipulated actually, I think, hurt the program, not helped it, because it was easy to chip away at it with all this other language. So I think we as academics need to do better with how we tell our story around research and its impact. And I think that's a sort of front stage, backstage conversation, but also making sure, and Katerina, I get so excited too, to think about what this next generation of scholars are doing and having a platform like this journal to do that with where you're going to get reviewers that are eclectic, right? And not just, why didn't you use this matching algorithm or this design? Like really digging into that, I think is key.
No, I'll just say, to add one quick thing, we my colleagues in the Katz School of Medicine, I'm in the main campus in the Department of Criminal Justice. We've created a large collaborative to constantly be saying we need to move from simply what works to how does it work. So every single time we are looking at an intervention, we're not saying we need $200,000 more to do a detailed process evaluation, but there has to be some component, some mixed method component that's unpacking the how, because we have to tell that story, whether it's success or failure, and then we can start doing, then we're contributing to the unpacking that black box.
I'm going to jump in here real quick to connect a few dots between my colleagues here. So I've been studying a cure violence type of community approach in Baltimore since 2007. I believe 14 different neighborhood sites over that, beginning in 2007 to where we are now in 2024. And the model has not changed much at all. And over a span of time, and I think I've done about 4 different iterations of evaluations of that work, there's remarkable success stories to get very excited about, to underscore what Andy was saying. But there's clearly plenty that did not have positive outcomes. And in my very first crack at this, this goes back probably to around 2010, 2011, and I was looking at the first 4 sites and saw just stunning reductions in 2 sites and very much the opposite in the other sites. And I said, well, I don't get it. It's the same intervention, the same resources, the same training. Why on earth would they be so different? And of course, the only way I could know that is to talk to the workforce and to get their stories. Tell me, what in the heck is going on? And to them, in that particular time, it was quite simple. There was really powerful leadership and buy-in and just total dedication in 2 sites that were connected to individuals, okay? To do this work, I think you have to be remarkably brave and incredibly skillful in your social interactions. You really have to be a special person. And in other sites, I'm sure they were fine individuals, but it was not the same. It was not the same sort of drive and whatever. But again, I don't want to totally put it on the backs of it's due to this individual or that individual totally, because again, studying this over a long span of time, what I also came to appreciate, partly again with more mixed methods kind of research, is the leadership at the city level of funding this really for a time period was really very out of touch. They let the workforce, they put it in contracts in a way that it was impossible to get a raise doing this dangerous, important community safety work for almost 8 years. Well, guess what? The program effects tanked during that time period. We had workers living out of their cars. And so what kind of effects are we going to expect if we don't support the workforce? And also, I will underscore, during that time period, they thought they would save a few dollars and just not do training at all. So it's the same program, right? You know, if we're just doing our quantitative research, we have data points over a long period of time. Well, I guess it just doesn't work anymore. But last thing I want to say, getting back to this foundational public health stuff, we're talking about, because we're in a very scholarly way, because that's what we do. That's wonderful. I love that. But there's something called public health practice, which is basically, you got to solve a problem. You got to figure out what's going on and do something practical that you can make things better. And to do that, you need this foundational kind of data about the nature of the problem that you're trying to solve. And cure violence in many public health approaches skip that very important foundational step in a public health approach. And what I think is going on right now with some of the declining effects that I'm seeing in sites in Baltimore and in Washington, D.C., is that the model that was created, as Andy said, many years ago, but cure violence, at least in the early 90s, in Chicago, you could have remarkable effects because you could work with these gang structures, get truces, and have remarkable, lasting, impressive results. Community violence doesn't look like that anymore. It doesn't remotely look like that. And yet our model is based upon what was going on in the early 1990s. We skipped that foundational piece. And I've been digging into some deep narrative data from shootings in Milwaukee, and it's stunning how the picture of community violence, I'm not saying completely is disconnected from cure violence or many CVI problems, but it's not a very good fit. And so I want to go back, I think, and sort of emphasize that we have to do that foundational, really in-depth examination. What are the set of circumstances? What are the stories behind these shootings? To better understand how we, again, in very practical terms, solve problems that are going to lower violence in communities.
Well, I'm going to tell one more short story and then give Alessandra a chance if you'd like to say one more thing, and then we can wrap up. And my short story is I'm constantly having these same tensions about, and my question is, are we really helping? And I was on another conversation about this a while ago, and a person who was deeply involved in this work, after hearing me talk, sort of came at me and said, basically, get your face out of our community. We don't need this. We don't need your data and your statistics. And he said something like, we know what we're doing. We know how to do this. We don't need you questioning us all the time. And it didn't occur to me until he was done talking that the whole time he's on screen, he's wearing a clerical collar. And I thought, well, of course, he's faith-oriented. You're not going to question your faith That's how he operates his whole life. That's his whole existence. And I think somehow we have to bridge this gap. Yes, faith, your desire to help your community generate your energy and your approach, and that's wonderful. But you need us as partners to help develop the evidence that the outside world may pay attention to. And I've said before to people, you need researchers as partners. Just don't let them at the podium or on stage with you. Have them in the back, helping you think about how to craft the questions, how to talk about the results, and then you lead. You're in front of the parade. You don't want us in the front because, as you were saying, Daniel, we love these conversations, but this is not the conversation to have with a group of neighborhood residents who are all concerned about their safety. We think this way, and you need the leadership at the community level, but they need us to help protect them from the future budget cutters and naysayers. So we need to work as partners. And Alessandra, I don't want to force you to jump in, but if you have anything you'd like to say, this is your chance.
Yes, no, thank you, Jeff. I think a lot of what I'm hearing is that we need to figure out how to get methods to talk to each other, and how to get us to talk to each other, right? So, as I mentioned before, qualitative work cannot exist without quantitative work. The issue is that quantitative work is always in the forefront, and it's fascinating because kind of like what Andrew was saying about how this stuff is not new, in particular in criminal justice, criminology, the shift from focusing on who's creating all these issues, why they're creating these issues, to there's an issue in general, moving away from understanding how our environments are shaping these issues, the sociological and just larger systemic issues that we have, the structures that we have that encourage or force some people into these situations are also missed when we only look at quantitative data, right? Something that I found challenging, but rewarding to do with my team in St. Louis when we were evaluating cure violence is having these conversations with each other. So I was working on the qualitative arm alongside folks working on the quantitative arm. And what we were doing is having conversations about, okay, what are you seeing? What am I seeing? And even though if you look at the results of our study, the quantitative work suggests that cure violence is not working, perhaps as intended, a lot of the qualitative work suggests that it is working. And when it got picked up by the media and just generally, a lot of the focus that happens just generally, as Jeff was mentioning, is that we lead with what is not working as opposed to what is working. And I think that change has to happen in these kind of conversation, these spheres. Change has to happen when both of the methodologies talk to each other, when we amplify the voices of the communities that are actually being harmed, right? So, I have 2 master's degrees and a PhD, and so that has given me legitimacy in the academy. But if I were to go on the streets and to try to do this work, I can't do this work. I don't have that kind of credibility. I don't have that resume that's needed. And so the skills that I have are overvalued in comparison to the skills that are needed to do this kind of work. So a researcher like me can help to kind of amplify these voices and can help to bring awareness to these kind of issues, but I can't do this work. We need to work in community with people who can do this work. And also understanding that they are people, right? And so as I believe as Daniel was mentioning the fact that some people were living in their cars, I talked to people who were at 4 a.m. getting calls from participants because they were afraid of a giant insect in their home, right? So professors work a ridiculous amount of hours, but I'm not getting calls from my students at 4 a.m. about an assignment. I might get an email, but I'm not going to respond to that email, right? Not particularly at 4 a.m. But these folks are on call 24/7. They are working and they are living the life. It's related to this kind of violence prevention work. And the fact that their stories and that their voices are being erased and replaced by numbers is a common issue that we continue to see in criminology, criminal justice, any of the ology kind of work, right? Any kind of these works, because we're so quantitatively focused. So I just think that change happens and change occurs when we work in conversation and community with people. And as I've mentioned before, I think that this issue, having these conversations, being open with the fact that a lot of these voices are being erased, being open with the fact that a lot of the workforce is also racialized too. We haven't really talked about that as well, right? So who are the workers? Why are they historically and contemporarily being marginalized? Why do we not care so much about their stories and the stuff that they're facing? Why aren't we paying them appropriately? Right? So I get paid and I get all of my kind of accolades by building a career off of the stories, right? Of the stories of these folks. In comparison, their payment does not reflect the amount of work they're doing 24/7. So I just think that instead of fighting and focusing on whose method is better, I think we might need to develop new methods, right? So I'm a queer criminologist. I do a lot of work in queer criminology that kind of is focused on destabilizing and challenging these methods that we typically use. So challenging quantitative research, trying to queer quantitative research. I think it's time for us to queer this field. I think it's time for us to queer public health approaches and develop perhaps new methodologies, and as opposed to kind of what Andrew was saying, like one size fits all, and stop kind of using these kind of, or maybe it was Daniel, stop using these kind of methods that have been used in the 90s and stuff like that, and try to figure out how do we develop new tools and resources that are actually representative of what we're seeing, and is inclusive of the people that we're working with.
Terrific. Thank you. Good final comment. I just want to thank all of the panelists for being here and participating in this conversation. I hope we help generate really good submissions to this special collection of inquiry. And I think we're going to hear briefly from the folks back at Sage Publications. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jeff, and to our panel for an engaging and important discussion. As we close out our session today, I would like to share a little bit more about the journal and the special collection. As I mentioned earlier, Inquiry is a peer-reviewed public health and policy journal, and we are actually celebrating our 60th year anniversary this year. Our mission is simple. It's to publish out impactful healthcare research that drives meaningful improvements in health outcomes. The journal is indexed across all the major databases, including Medline and Scopus, and we have an impact factor of 1.7. Our articles are published out on an open access basis, and so that means that rather than being behind a paywall, our articles are free to read, use, and cite. Going along with that, we have a broad and diverse audience of healthcare stakeholders to make sure that the research reaches the right audience and has the necessary impact. Our publisher is Sage, which is a leading independent academic publisher since 1965. Now moving on to the logistics of the collection is currently open for submissions, and the deadline is the end of January 2025. Our hope is to finalize the collection by the middle of next year. Published articles will be hosted on a landing page and widely disseminated to a relevant audience to ensure maximum visibility and impact. We also urge you to share out the collection with your colleagues and to present the relevant articles at conferences to ensure it reaches the right audience and has the necessary impact. Now, since the journal is open access, though there is no submission fee, there is a post-acceptance article processing charge of $2,800 per paper. I would urge you to check whether your research funding covers some or all of this cost, or indeed to check with your library whether any institutional deals with our publisher Sage might cover some or all of this cost. Otherwise, we certainly do not want the upcoming deadline or a lack of funding to be a barrier towards sharing out good research, and so if any of those are the cases, do reach out to Jeff, Katerina, or myself, and we are happy to look into those requests on a case-by-case basis. Finally, for us, it's paramount that we provide excellent author service and promote out the research as quickly as possible. And so therefore, with this collection, our hope is that we make a first decision post peer review within 2 months, and we accept decisions within 4 months of the original submission date. Moving on. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to myself or the guest editors, and for your convenience, we have listed the relevant emails and links on the slide. All that's left for me to do is to thank our session chair, Professor Jeffrey Butts, and our panelists for an important discussion, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope you found this session helpful, and we look forward to your submissions. We will log off now, but thank you again, and bye.